Welcome to our second study. Last time we looked at the place of lament and how this is a helpful discipline for us as we learn how our world struggles with a pandemic. This time we'll be scanning through the other parts of the Old Testament, some wisdom and some prophecy, to try to understand what is happening in our world from a Christian viewpoint. For this study, we'll be looking at the themes set out in the book God and the Pandemic by Tom Wright, and we'll be seeing an interview that he gave a bit later on as well. You'll have been thinking about our introductory questions, which centred on what God might be saying at this time and what message you are hearing from the heavens. And it's true that people look to prophecy and the end times to try to make sense of what we're going through now. But I'm glad that as a church, we are really beginning to engage with these questions. Recently, we conducted a survey about people's relationship with God during the pandemic. And I was amazed that of the 40 responses that we had, almost half of the people said that they felt closer to God, and nobody said that they felt more distant. In our suffering and our pain and our desolation, it seems we cry out to God in lament and hope and praise. And as we search for understanding about human suffering and often don't find the answers, a great place for us to start looking is in the book of Job.
There are 3 books in the Bible known as the wisdom literature: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. The first, Proverbs, showed us that God is wise and just.
Yeah, we learned that God has ordered the world so that it's fair. The righteous are rewarded, the wicked are punished. In other words, you get what you deserve.
But then we meet Ecclesiastes, who observes, people don't always get what they deserve.
Yeah, he said the world isn't always fair, that life is unpredictable and hard to comprehend, just like smoke.
And this makes you wonder, okay, well, is God wise and just?
Exactly. And so it's that question that is being explored in the final book of wisdom, Job.
All right, let's dive in.
So Job begins with a strange story that takes place up in the heavens, which are described something like a heavenly command center. So God is there with these angelic creatures called the sons of God, and they're all there reporting for duty.
And God points out this guy Job, his servant, showing how righteous and good he is.
And then one of these angelic creatures approaches. He's referred to in Hebrew as the Satan.
The Satan? Who is this?
Well, this word is actually a title, which literally means the one who is opposed. So out of this whole crew, he is the one questioning how God is running the world. And he proposes that Job might not actually love God, that he's only a good person because God rewards him. If God were to take away all of the good things he gave to Job, then we would see his true colors.
So he thinks Job is just working the system?
That's exactly right. Maybe he's obeying just to get what he wants.
So God agrees to this experiment and allows the Satan to inflict suffering on Job.
And Job loses everyone and everything that he cares about. It is devastating. And remember, he deserves none of this. God himself said so.
The remarkable thing is that in the midst of all this suffering, Job still praises God.
At least for chapters 1 and 2. But then in chapter 3, we find out how he's really feeling inside. He unleashes this poem that reveals this devastation. It's a long, elaborate curse on the day that he was born.
After this, some of Job's friends come to visit him to offer their help. And all of them are like, Job, you must have done something horribly wrong to deserve this. After all, we know God is just, and we know the world is ordered by God's justice and fairness, so you must be getting what you deserve.
And for the next 34 chapters, the friends and Job go back and forth in very dense Hebrew poetry. His friends keep speculating about why God might have sent such suffering, and they even start making up lists of hypothetical sins that Job must have committed. But after each accusation, Job defends his innocence.
And Job is innocent.
He is. He's also on an emotional roller coaster. At some moments, he's very confident that God is still wise and just.
Yeah, in other moments, he's doubting God's goodness.
He even comes to accuse God of being reckless, unfair, and corrupt. So by the end of the dialogues, Job demands that God come and explain himself in person, and God does so. He comes in the form of a great storm cloud.
Now, God doesn't give Job a direct answer. He doesn't tell Job about the conversation with the Satan.
Yeah, he does something very different. He takes Job on a virtual tour of the universe. He shows Job how grand the world is, and he asks him if he's even capable of running it or understanding it, just for a day. He shows Job how much detail there is in the world, things that we might see every day, but really don't understand at all. But God does. He knows it all intimately. He pays attention to the beauty and operations of the universe in ways that we haven't even imagined and in places that we will never see.
Then to conclude, God shows Job two wondrous beasts and brags about how great they are.
Yeah, they are dangerous. I mean, they would kill you without even thinking about it. And God says they're not evil. They're actually a part of his good world.
And then that's it. That's God's whole defense. It's kind of weird. I mean, what was this all about?
It seems to be this. From Job's point of view, it looks like God is not just. But God's perspective is infinitely bigger. He's dynamically interacting with a whole universe of complexity when he makes decisions. And this is what God calls his wisdom.
So Job asking God to defend himself is actually kind of absurd.
He couldn't comprehend this kind of complexity even if he wanted to.
So where does this leave us?
Well, it leaves Job in a place of humility. He never learned why he suffered, and yet he's able to live in peace and in the fear of the Lord.
But that's not where the book ends, because after this, God restores to Job double everything he had lost. And this, again, is surprising. I mean, is this a reward? Is God saying, "Congratulations, Job, you passed this elaborate test"?
No, I mean, the whole book just made the point that Job losing everything was not a punishment, and so now getting it back isn't a reward.
So why does he get it back?
Well, apparently, God, in his wisdom, decided to give Job a gift. We don't know why. But what we do know is that Job is now the kind of person who, no matter what comes, good or bad, he can trust God's wisdom.
And that's the book of Job, and the end of our wisdom series.
These biblical books of wisdom are amazing. Each one offers a unique perspective on the good life, and you need to hear all of them together as you learn to live with wisdom and in the fear of the Lord.
As we look at the pandemic from a historical perspective, it's important to note that we have been here before. The Black Death killed 200 million people in the Middle Ages, and 100 years ago, the Spanish flu wiped out 3% of the world's population. In comparison, COVID-19 has not been anywhere near as deadly, but its effects on an interconnected global community have been vast. But what are the theological issues to look at as we discuss the pandemic? What is the role of prophecy and of wisdom and of lament? In his book, Tom Wright encourages us to look at this from a Christological viewpoint, with Christ at the centre, and to work backwards and forwards from there.
Time magazine asked me if I would do a short piece on the whole COVID-19 thing when it first began, which was back in March or sometime. And I thought, well, I don't really have very much to say about it, but there's a couple of things, little points to make. So I did that. And the next thing I knew, there was quite a sort of backlash on social media. I don't look at Twitter and so on, but friends were telling me, hey, so-and-so says this and so-and-so says that. Are you going to respond? A lot of people who were saying things like, if you look at the prophet Amos, it's obvious that when this kind of thing happens, it's because somebody has done something bad. And so people actually said, N.T. Wright obviously doesn't read the Bible anymore because it's quite obvious in Deuteronomy and Lamentations and so on. And so I thought, wait a minute. I actually do read the book of Amos, but I also read the book of Job, and I do read Lamentations, but I also read Psalm 44. And I started to think about the way in which the different strands of the Old Testament jangle against each other, and they're only resolved when you get to Jesus himself. So then it becomes part of the larger theological project to say, if you want to talk about God and what God is doing, please don't dream of doing that until you've looked very carefully at God incarnate. And one of the reasons the Gospels are what they are is not just pretty little stories about Jesus and then, oh, by the way, he died for our sins. This is about how God takes charge of the world, and it's not the way that people normally imagine. So the whole thing is a way of saying, let's live within the biblical narrative. And when we come out the other side of the Jesus story, we find things look quite different, and they give us a spirit-driven imperative for who we're supposed to be in the middle of it all.
You know, yeah, and reading your book, God in the Pandemic, that continues to be one of the main themes throughout the book is continue to focus on Jesus. And so, you know, you talk about the book of Job, and there's this mystery of the suffering that he went through, and I found that fascinating.
Well, and suffering is always a mystery, because even when you can see a definite reason, you did X and therefore Y happened, which is comparatively rare, but it does happen. And obviously with the exile, particularly, passages like Lamentations or Daniel chapter 9 or whatever say, yeah, you promised that if we messed up and worshipped idols, we would be in exile. Well, we did, and here we are. And so now please get us out of it. So there are times when you can do that. But again and again, there is no solution of that kind of easy sort. And I noticed that exactly the same thing happens in the New Testament, where you get some completely unresolved things, like in Acts 12, where James gets killed at the beginning of the chapter and Peter gets out of jail free a few verses later. If I was James's mum, I wouldn't much like Acts chapter 12. You know, hang on, why did God do this for her boy and not for mine? You know, so there's all sorts of unresolved tensions, but then these come together in Romans chapter 8, one of the best known chapters in the New Testament. But people don't always realize what's being said, that when we are groaning in travail within the pain of the world, then Paul says the Spirit is groaning within us with inarticulate groanings. In other words, there is a time when even God the Holy Spirit doesn't have words to say what one might want to say out of the pain and horror and shame of the world. And that, to me, is a very profound Pauline insight, which we need to carry forward. And it stops us thinking that because we're Christians, we must have the answer, and we've got to have it by this evening or we're not doing our job. The answer may sometimes be to stay there without words, without an articulated reason why it's all happening. And that, it seems to me, is a profoundly biblical place to be.
You know, I work with persecuted Christians, and I've interviewed hundreds of them. And I have, long ago, I've had to say, you know what, I'm just not going to figure this out. Why does God protect some people? And they had these amazing stories, testimonies of how God saved them. And then you've got a whole village of followers of Jesus, which we just heard about in Nigeria.
Just wiped out.
Yeah, just wiped out. And so, but we want to, Dr. Wright, understand or to somehow have the answer, and there's that pressure. Do we just have to kind of let that go? And as you talk about, let the church be the church and head to the front lines and show the love of Jesus?
That, of course, is always the case, that if the church is looking over its shoulder to say we need to figure out why this happened, it may well be missing out the vocation of actually going to help right now. And the paradigm for this is John chapter 9, where the man born blind, Jesus' followers say, was it he who sinned or was it his parents? And Jesus says, no, it was neither of them. This was so that the works of God might be revealed. And then it turns out to be the works of Jesus, which are, of course, embodying the works of God. And the man gets healed. Although even then, that causes more problems because his parents are worried about it and he gets thrown out of the synagogue. So it's not resolved fully. He gets his sight, but he gets a lot of trouble with it as well. And I think so much of the New Testament, book of Revelation or First Peter or whatever, is saying, yes, at the moment, in the present time, we are living in the post-resurrection moment. So with the Spirit, God is doing all sorts of new things, but the forces of evil, the forces of darkness and death are still very active. And it is the classic Christian position to be caught between those two forces, as it were. And that's why suffering for the Christian has the particular character it does. But let me say this. I think particularly the last 200 or 300 years in the Western world, we've lived in a very rationalistic age. Now, that has waned with postmodernity and various things which have been discounting reason. But many, many Christians still are faced with, not least, atheist objections, saying, we think Christianity doesn't make sense. And the problem of evil is part of it. And so Christians are coming back and saying, we've got to show how everything makes sense. Otherwise, we're not doing our job. And the danger with that is that we almost want to play God. We want to be able to sit upstairs and look down and say, this happened and that, and therefore, da-da-da-dum. And the Bible again and again says, no, you don't do that. It is God who sits above the circle of the earth. Our task is to wait for him. That's Isaiah 40. Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. Whatever is going on, it doesn't mean we can't reflect on bad things that happen. And there may well be lessons to be learned on the global scale from a pandemic like this. Who was using the food chain in the wrong way, or who was using markets or whatever in the wrong way. Let's actually go into that. But that's not the same as trying to say, now, from a theological point of view, we can see what God was trying to do, because very often we don't know that. For much of church history, people haven't tried to do that. It's actually the old pagan thing to do. If bad things happen to a city, it's because the gods are angry.
So
Watch
this is
out
more of a new
for that
thing then
pagan
that's
temptation.
happening. Yeah,
It is.
This is just more in the last, as you say, last 200 or 300 years.
I think so, because if you look back at the church fathers, obviously earthquakes happen, plagues happen, people died of all sorts of things. The average life expectation in the ancient world was sort of 20s or 30s or 50s if you were lucky, and all sorts of people died from all kinds of causes. And people didn't say, oh dear, this means we can't believe in God. They knew that the world was dark and mysterious, but they felt welling up within them the love of God and the life of the Spirit and the presence of Jesus. And so they knew that they were God's people, not because they could figure out everything that was going on in the world. That's a kind of post-Enlightenment ambition which we in the West have had. And it's dangerous when Christians try to join in too closely with that.
Yeah, and we lose credibility, I think, to those that are viewing what the church's response to this. Now, you talk a lot in the book about lamenting, and I know you mentioned Romans 8, the groaning. Explain lamenting. I mean, most Christians that know the Bible know there's a book called Lamentations. Dr. Ray, how do we do that?
I think the way to start is the way Jesus does it, which is to start with the Psalms of Lament. I've mentioned 42 and 43, there's 44 as well, 22, 88. There are many Psalms which you can take when everything has gone dark, Psalm 88 particularly. And if it's not gone dark for you, maybe for somebody you know or love or somebody you've heard of, and you can just slowly pray those Psalms, holding on to the pain in the middle of the darkness, and not seeking any resolution, just seeking to lay that situation before God. And that kind of strips away the arrogant sense that I know what the answer is and I'm going to tell God he ought to provide it right now. And so in the same way, Jesus in Gethsemane, he is lamenting, loud cries and tears, says the letter to the Hebrews. And that was because he wanted to say to God, please, isn't there another way? And when he said it, he knew in his bones that the answer was, nevertheless, not my will, but yours. And so lament it's not a stoic resignation. It's a committal to the God who we know to be the God of love, but whose ways remain mysterious. And if they were mysterious even to Jesus in Gethsemane, and even to the Spirit in Romans 8, it's no shame to say that God's ways are mysterious to us. But when we weep at the grave of somebody that we've loved and lost, especially when it was kind of, a horrible accident or whatever, then we get angry. And that's right too. And the Psalms are full of that. Yeah. So I would say take the Psalms and then read through some of the key stories in the Gospels and feel the pain and pathos of Jesus, particularly Jesus weeping at the tomb of Lazarus. Even though he knows he's going to raise him, Jesus still weeps, and he's not putting it on, he's not pretending. There is that. And in other words, we are called to share the weeping of Jesus himself. That's no bad place to be. Not a comfortable place, not a nice place to be, but it's a good place to be.